Well, good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and it's my great honor to host tonight an extraordinary forum with a quite unusual topic and a very unusual panel. So we're fortunate to have what I hope is going to be a really exciting evening. The topic here on the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I is the question that was set: could World War I happen again? And that's actually going to be my first question to our panelists. The panelists, you have their resumes in your program, so I won't read those to you, but I would say we have in the group here in Etel Solingen, who's a professor at the University of California, Irvine, somebody who's a leading political scientist who studies historical phenomenon that may be relevant for informing current policy. In our colleague, Dick Rosencrance, we have a professor here at the Kennedy School who was previously a professor at UCLA and at Cornell, and who's been the co-organizer and co-author of a volume, which he's brought the first copy of, on World War I, called The Next Great War, which will be published this fall, December 1st, and he'll say something more about that. And finally, our cleanup hitter is Nick Burns. Nick is a professor of practice of diplomacy here at the Kennedy School, and clearly one of the leading practitioners of diplomacy in his generation, and the leader of an initiative here at the Kennedy School to try to revive diplomacy as a thought that it might be a solution to problems without fighting wars. A radical idea in the US, I know, but nonetheless, I think a very worthy one. So this is going to be fun, and meant to be fun. To introduce the topic, well, looking back at 1914, we're going to ask, why did World War I occur? And could it have been prevented? And looking forward, we're going to ask to the year ahead, could a great power war as catastrophic as what happened in 1914 happen in the year ahead? And if so, who could do what to make that less likely? So for many of the audience, I'm sure the thought that the year ahead might hold a great power war between the US and someone seems literally inconceivable. But I would remind you that when we make claims about what is inconceivable, this is a comment not about what's possible in the world. This is a comment about what our limited minds can conceive. So Mark Twain observed famously, history never repeats itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. So the dynamic of this discussion is whether there's some rhyme, maybe not a perfect one, but an interesting one, between what happened 100 years ago this year and what happened this year. And just to set the scene, I'm going to take about 90 seconds, and I have 3 slides. The first, you can see a picture on the board here, or on the screen. If you're not a student in my class, so since I use this in my class, for anybody else, can you guess what that is? So next slide, yeah. Can we take a next slide? Yeah. So if you go to the Netherlands in The Hague, where Nick and I were last, March. Yeah. This building, the Peace Palace in The Hague, houses the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Arbitration. It was opened when? August 1913. Financed by whom? Next slide. Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, whom you've heard of before from the Carnegie Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation and the Carnegie Endowment and the Carnegie Libraries all over the US, was the richest man in the world in his era. He was Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Carlos Slim all in one. And after he had made his fortune as building the steel industry in the US, he became a great philanthropist. January 1st, first day, New Year's Day, 1914, he sent out his traditional New Year's greetings to 2,000 or 3,000 of his nearest and dearest, who included every king, every prime minister, every president, all of whom, all the important ones, he knew on a first-name basis. And here's what it said. He said, I'm glad to tell you this is going to be a great year because international peace will now prevail through the great powers agreeing to settle their disputes by international law, the pen proving mightier than the sword. So that's January 1, 1914. And he explained that now that we had the Peace Palace, which we saw a picture of before, no longer would it be necessary for states to fight wars to settle disputes. They could refer the disputes to the International Court of Justice, which was International Court of Arbitration, which was housed at the Peace Palace. So we know what happened. 4 years later, Europe was laid waste. The center of the previous millennium of energy and leadership in the world was over. And who won? Nobody. At the end of the war, every leader who brought the war who participated in the actions that led the war was gone. So the Kaiser, gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. The Tsar of Russia overthrown by the Bolsheviks. France bled for a generation. England shorn of its youth and its treasure. So they never recovered, in effect. Okay? So a catastrophe happened that was, to Andrew Carnegie and most of the rest of the world, totally inconceivable in January 1st, 1914. So that's where we are today. That's what we're going to explore. And let me start with the first question, which is, could it happen again? So could we imagine World War I, a scenario of that sort, leading to war in the 12 months ahead? Or if we were doing it like political scientists, we would say, the war happened at the end of the year. So by October 2015, by what scenario was this possible? So who wants to start?
Well, I would start by saying, no, it's not possible. So I'm disagreeing with the question. But I do think that war is still possible, even if it's not possible in 2015. Because when one looks back at World War I, it's impossible to imagine that it could so easily have occurred, and yet it did. There were so many reasons for it not to occur that the surprising thing is that those did not dominate the situation. Almost every country in Europe at that time would have benefited from a period of economic growth, international trade, a series of exchanges of various kinds between them, and yet World War I still occurs. And that's the question that's very important for us today. If not in 2015, that at least at some point, people who otherwise have no emotions toward war can nonetheless get caught in it.
So you're saying you just can't conceive of a war, a great power war between the U.S. and somebody by October 2015. So
That's
we'll
right.
call you Andrew Carnegie too.
Okay.
How about our other panelists? Atola, can you or Nick imagine, again, not that it's likely, nobody is here predicting likely, simply that it's barely conceivable or it could happen. What would you say?
Everything is conceivable in our imagination, as you started, but extremely unlikely in the next 12 months or your time period there. And slightly dissenting with,
Good.
Dick, slightly, but only slightly, because I do think there were signs and signals quite early on in the early 20th century that war might happen. The signals weakened and strengthened at different points in time, the crisis and so on, but it was not inconceivable. And there were very forceful and virulent statements about the possibility of war even then, which I don't see today.
Well, now, we had here last week John Mearsheimer,
Yes.
a colleague whom we all know, who's a famous professor at the University of Chicago. And the thesis, or the title of his argument is Why China Cannot Rise Peacefully. And his proposition, you can see a foreign affairs version of it, is somewhat to the contrary. So I don't know, Nick, what do you think?
I think the answer to your question is yes. A catastrophic great power conflict is possible by October 2015. Our capacity as human beings for miscalculation, for hubris, for the inability to see around corners, the inability to always understand what the other person is doing. We see it time and time in American foreign policy and in global politics. It is certainly possible. I don't think that we're likely at all to see a great power conflict in Europe. I think President Obama rightly has decided that we're not going to fight for Ukraine. We're going to use other means, sanctions, to express our displeasure with Putin. I also don't think a great power conflict is likely in the true crisis center of the world, the Middle East. We've just had an extraordinary presentation upstairs by Ambassador Robert Ford about the combined crisis in Syria and Iraq. But the Russians, Americans, Chinese, the countries with huge power, conventional and nuclear, are not going to fight over Syria and Iraq. I worry about the East China Sea, not the South China Sea, but the East China Sea, where an ever-nationalist Chinese leadership and a nationalist Japanese leadership are near collision. We have a point of view about the Senkaku-Daiju dispute, and that was expressed by President Obama in March in Tokyo. If the Japanese are attacked in the Senkaku Islands, then that does fall under the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty, thereby possibly setting up a Chinese-American-Japanese conflict. So it's possible. Is it probable? It's highly improbable, because I think rightly President Obama has made a point of trying to establish a working relationship with Xi Jinping. It's not firmly established, but there's a symbiosis of interest between the two. I think sufficient communication between the two that we can avoid a great power conflict. But is it possible? Yes. And it's the duty of men and women who serve in government always to keep that in mind.
Maybe even in the academy. So let's do one more round on this. So I like the fact that we have differences, and I will express my view personally that I agree with Nick, okay? So let's first drill down on the scenarios for a war between the U.S. and China, just conceivably. Again, not likely, but the question is whether possible, even though our minds say absolutely not. Right? So again, go back to January 1st, 1914. If you said to Andrew Carnegie, can you conceive these nations going to war? He would have said, forget about it. I just told you. I build a palace. I send out my New Year's Day greeting. So it's okay. Okay, don't worry. So if I think we should stick with the scenario in the East China Sea, not the South China Sea. So if I do it in scenario terms, we've already had ships almost sink each other, Chinese and American ships. We've also already had China's declaration of an air exclusion zone, in which the question of whether planes going through it would be harassed or perhaps downed. We should remember, at the beginning of the Bush administration, a U.S. spy plane was downed by a collision with a Chinese fighter. Again, maybe just at the initiative of a pilot. So here, every day in the East China Sea, you have near encounters between American and Chinese ships, and Japanese and Chinese ships, and Japanese and Chinese aircraft. So, okay, one step. So, is it easy to imagine a ship gets sunk or a plane gets down? Well, of course it is. I mean, stuff happens. So now then, everything calms down, maybe. Maybe there's a response. And if there's a response, maybe it escalates. So I'm just saying,
Yeah.
what's wrong with that? Yeah.
It's the
Well,
context.
Could I
Okay.
just say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're quite right. This could happen at a certain point in time. I think not in the next 12 months. But nonetheless, the key difference, I think, between now and then is you can have conflicts among your allies or even among your naval vessels, as we've seen, without it escalating to anything. So after the thing that occurred in the 90s, the planes landed. The pilots were released. There are nuclear weapons now. There were no nuclear weapons in 1914. There's every reason for things that might possibly occur to be held within limits today in a way that was not true then. Then, it was better to act first. It was better to get the offensive rolling and get the benefits of offense dominance that existed then. Offense dominance does not exist today, in my judgment.
So, Etel?
I agree with that, and to pile on the point, there are major differences in the context of 1914 and 2014. One major difference is that the so-called rising power, China, is not the Kaiserreich in 1914, the German Reich. Very different political entities. Yes, both authoritarian, but extremely different foundations of political economy. The ruling coalitions in China today are very, very different from the ruling coalition in Germany circa 1914, and even earlier, the period preceding 1914. At that time, protectionism ruled the world in the Kaiserreich, and increased tariffs. The German leadership was extremely dominated by a military establishment, a military industrial complex, a navy industrial complex, an agrarian industrial complex. None of those things are true for China today. China is an internationalizing ruling coalition today. It derives its revenues not from customs, from duties, the way the Kaiserreich did, and it depends very much on the global economy to survive in power. That's one leading difference. But there are many things that stem from that, including, for instance, the relationship between civil and military, the civilian and military leadership. In 1914 Germany, the military extremely powerful. In China today, civilian control of the military. Militarization in 1914 as a militarization of society and state. Not so today in China, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so there's a good list of differences, but
Yes.
each time you listed a difference, it occurred to me, for example, I mean, we have a China working group here. We were doing a China discussion of the Chinese military. If you look at the number of actions that seem to be taken that seem to surprise the Chinese leadership, it looks like the military is not the
Right.
most subservient entity in every instance. So I don't know, Nick, you look like you had a
Well,
had a
Graham
thought.
is fond of quoting the Washington maxim, where you stand is where you sit. And where I sat for most of my career was in Washington or in an embassy or consulate. You have significant government experience. And one of the things that you always have to keep in mind, and that your superiors urge you to keep in mind, especially when you work for the strongest state in the world, is what could go wrong? What's the worst thing that could happen? And as you propose a policy solution to any issue, a Secretary of State is going to say, but okay, before we march down that road, what could go wrong? And so I'm just not comfortable with the assertion that it can't happen, we're too smart, we know too much, we're smarter than those people back in 1914. I think it's not a rational proposition for the Chinese leadership or the Japanese leadership to go to war over these islets. Sometimes you can see the rocks, low tide, sometimes at high tide you can't. Not worth it. No human beings live there, etc. But you do have the near collision, so what you worry about is miscalculation. Because of that concern about miscalculation, you need a mediator. There is no officially declared mediator, but I think I know who the mediator is. His name is Barack Obama. He's worked on this problem with the Japanese leadership to try to counsel restraint. He's definitely worked on this problem with the Chinese leadership to try to talk about the stakes involved and to try to interpret Abe for Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping for Abe. And my view is that the president has handled this in the right way. But I still worry about that possibility, and therefore we have to be sensitive to it, and the United States has to understand what its role is. We have to be true to our treaty commitment to Japan, and yet we have to talk sense to the Japanese about restraint. Last point, just one last point. I'm just reading the newspapers here, so I have no particular inside information, but if you read the newspapers and pay attention, and we have a very, very smart professor at MIT, Taylor Fravel, who studies this every day, it looks like the Chinese have been much more restrained in their deployments to the Senkakus over the last couple of months, and that gives me heart and confidence that this message of restraint by the United States is getting through.
Could
There
I
are
just
many
add
other
one difference between the two cases? It does seem to be that now, doing exactly as you suggested, Nick, with Obama as an intermediary between the Chinese and the Japanese, let's say, not taking sides, but trying to make sure that they can work something out. That is not what happened in 1914. In 1914, you have the Kaiser giving the blank check, telling Austria to do anything it wanted to, they would be backed up. I think that's absolutely inconceivable to imagine occurring today.
Okay, so let me go back to Etel's earlier point. So we're done some of the differences, but one of the sections of your book, Dick, looks at the structural stress that occurs when a rising power rivals a ruling power.
Right.
I've discussed this in my chapter there as Thucydides' trap. And if you look at Athens' rise and the fear in China, in Sparta, lo and behold, one thing leads to the other. And Thucydides says it was the rise of Athens and the fear that inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. If I look at the 1914 case, it looks to me like a rising Germany creates a lot of paranoia in Britain over a decade, and particularly as you see the naval component of it. Now, it's obviously hugely more complex than that, but as we think about the Thucydidean proposition, if I ask myself, has China been rising dramatically? Yeah. Does a rising China feel more self-confident? Yes. Is it proud? Yes. Does it feel like it should be more assertive? Yes. Does it imagine that it should have more say and sway in international politics? Yes. So as a Chinese friend of mine said to me last year, he said, watching American ships as the patrolling all of the seas in the area and American planes running along their 12-mile limit every day, have you ever looked at your map and asked yourself, why are these adjacent waters called China Seas? Isn't that called American Seas? This is called South China Sea. We China. East China Sea. We East China. So what is it that you should become? Your Navy should be the force there, patrolling the waters and serving as the arbiter. Now, from an American point of view, we say, Sri Karo, we provided a security environment that was good for you when you grew up and things were, you should be grateful. And in any case, we're there, we're the Navy. So if you're trying to exclude us from the territory, that's called anti-access aerial denial. In the Defense Department language, A2, D2. Oh, that's bad. Okay? So do you see this dynamic or you don't see it?
Well,
Adele?
Yeah, no,
please.
no. One problem we have in our field, international relations, by the way, not history, is the problem of approaching states as monolithic entities. China says this or that, the US does it. But in reality, they're not monolithic entities. So I can conceive of almost every state, but certainly China, as divided roughly between two ideal typical sort of constituencies. An internationalizing constituency that would think very differently about what you're talking about, the East China Sea and the South China Sea and so on and so forth. And an inward-looking constituency, including maybe segments of the PLA, not all of it, state enterprises and so on and so forth. Constituencies that might stand to benefit more from this assertiveness. And this balance of power, if you will, internal to China, as is the case for other countries, vies for control of the country. And occasionally when you see those tensions surfacing, it's very likely that one faction asserts itself more, as in the incidents that you're citing. So the question is less what will China do, but who will be in control of China, in my view.
Could I just respond on that one point? It does seem to me the thing we worry about is the Thucydides trap occurring again and again and again, as it has certainly occurred, as you quite rightly say, throughout history. There are two cases where it didn't occur, though, that are very important. One is when the U.S. rose and passed Great Britain. It didn't occur then. There was no fighting. And it didn't occur either with the rise of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union got to a certain point, and then it ran out of gas. And all of a sudden, it decided it would rather be part of a Western coalition, or at least work out a deal, than keep pushing ahead unsuccessfully. Now, can we use that for incentives to China? I think in the longer term we can. Perhaps not in the short term, but I think in the longer term, we can draw China in to an economic coalition that is so strong that if they tried to go against it, their whole economy would be affected. And I think when you consider how much investment they have in the United States, how they depend upon our technology, how they depend upon exchanges between countries economically, and of course, here at Harvard, we have a tremendous number of extremely good Chinese students that I hope we're seducing every day to develop a closer tie with the United States.
I would say that the United States and China are indeed, in a way, monolithic entities. Xi Jinping and the PLA possess enormous military capacity, as does President Obama and his military leadership. And that's what you've got to worry about. In my Great Powers class last April, our new senior fellow, Ambassador Steve Bosworth, told our students, trying to figure out how to regulate the U.S.-China relationship will be the most difficult global challenge the United States has ever had, he said, has ever had in the history of the United States. He sees it in very big terms, the potential opportunity and the potential calamity of two great powers clashing. It's a big statement. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to understand that someone with that experience, if he says it, you pay attention to it.
That doesn't mean it can't be done.
No, and I was
It's just very difficult.
that was point two. I was getting to it.
Okay.
So point two is the United States and China have this very delicate balance that we're going to have to maintain with each other. On the one hand, Dick, it's your point, and it's a very good point. If we see this not as a zero-sum game, but if we see that the United States and China have a lot of responsibility for global peace, security, and that we have to confront the big problems together, like climate, and President Obama is trying to do that with Xi Jinping right now, like the cyber problems, the terrorist problem. If we're, in effect, part of the global governing body of the world together, it puts us in a much better framework to see each other as inescapable symbiotic partners for the future. And I think that's where our students, our American students, need to see the Chinese students like that. We are going to be lifelong partners. So our most important partner is going to be China on all the ways we have to confront major challenges. But here's the problem. Our most important competitor for power is going to be China in East Asia. So we have to be awfully good, awfully adept and sophisticated to keep the balance so that we can work together, we can compete fairly together, but not end up in a catastrophic war. We're going to have to be good every day for the next 50 or 60 years, both sides, to maintain that balance.
And if we go, I like that point hugely, because it relates to, so what do we do? Okay? And I think if we connect it to Dick Rosencrance's point about that there's some cases of rise that threatened and even eventually overtook the rule that worked out successfully. Now, if we think about those cases, though, they may not make us all that comfortable. So let me just go one more round on that. So let's take the rise of the U.S. and the fear that this created in Britain. So in 1902, Salisbury, who had been the prime minister before, the year before he died, wrote a very nice note in which he said, we should have crushed the Americans during the Civil War, but unfortunately now it's too late. Okay, so there were plenty of Brits in the Admiralty in the first decade of the 20th century. When they said, who's the number one threat? They said it's the Americans and the American Navy. So we're all familiar with this complicated story. So here comes the Americans. Now, unfortunately for the Brits, so were the Germans coming. And they were a little closer, a little more directly threatening. So when Teddy Roosevelt, if we just go back 100 years in American history and ask how did Teddy Roosevelt regard things, he regarded it as a total anomaly that the British would have their fleet patrolling American waters in our hemisphere. I mean, as they had for 100 years when we didn't have a Navy. But once we had a Navy, he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, they should be out of there. I mean, I went fishing this summer in Alaska. Okay? And if you look at the Alaska, it's a great story. There's a big blob, that's called Alaska. And then there's this funny tail that goes for about 400 miles down the coast of Canada, cutting Canada off from the sea. How did that happen? Well, there's this place where we were fishing. It's called Tongass National Forest.
Yes.
John Muir had gone to visit there. He said, it looks like 100 Yosemites. He wrote to Teddy Roosevelt and said, this is fantastic. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a big fan of Muir, and they had done Yosemite and all that, said, well, this must be American. So we had a contest with the Canadians. Teddy Roosevelt threatened to fight about it. We took it. So this was like Alaska, but we didn't even pay for it. So if I look and say, how that accommodation required a lot of attitude and action adjustment by the British to give the Americans some more space. Now, does that sound like us?
Yes. Vis-a-vis China.
Which one, now or then?
Well, put aside then, I mean, I do think that we're going to have to give China more space if we're going to get a solution. After all, Bismarck brought in the British at a time when there was a balance, and the British came in and created an overbalance. It was a 4 versus 1 arrangement in 1887, and that made possible peace. The real problem in 1914 is we didn't have an overbalance in which someone like Bismarck had brought in a big coalition. We just had Triple Entente versus Triple Alliance. Neither one of those was going to be deterred. What you needed was to have the United States involved. The United States was ultimately involved, right? 1917 we came in. Suppose we'd indicated in 1914 that we'd be supporting the Triple Entente. That would have been it, and the war would not have taken place. There are all sorts of things that we can do vis-a-vis China to draw it into an overwhelming coalition. Consider ourselves and the Europeans and the Japanese. Together we have $40 trillion of GDP. And I don't care what the Chinese have, even if it's 10 trillion or 11 or whatever, it isn't going to compare to this grouping of great economic powers that will suck it into their orbit rather than have to balance against it. I think this is the key over the longer term. to make China part of a broader international economic entity in which we all participate.
So I've said a lot of conciliatory things about China, and I meant them. I think that we need to see the Chinese as our partner. But now let me say a more tough-minded thing that I think does reflect mainstream Republican and Democratic Party views among the most likely people who are going to lead us in the future, say in 2016 and 20, and that is that the United States, contrary, Graham, to your example about Teddy Roosevelt's view of the British and the Caribbean, the United States is a Pacific power. We're an Asian Pacific country. Just look at our coastline, look at our history, look at many of our states oriented there. And, you know, we also have alliances. We have defense alliance, treaty alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand. We have growing security ties with India and Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore and Vietnam. And so if the Chinese just want to have a map where the United States disappears, it's not going to happen. So they need to also see us as their partner, but they have to understand the United States is not going to walk away from our interests and our treaty commitments, especially when most of those countries, most but not all those countries are democracies, especially when those treaties are designed to support a stable democratic Asia. So the rising power needs to have a mature, objective look at the established power needs to have a mature, objective look at the rising power, but the rising power needs to be sensitive to the interests and prerogatives of the established power as well. Both of us have responsibility for the balance, not just the U.S. And if you listen to the Chinese leadership, it's almost as if the United States is a foreigner in that part of the world, and that negates the history of the last 65 years.
And in most of the cases, either one or the other of the two parties doesn't have the far-sighted view that you suggest. There's a reason why in the lists that Dick and I have done, 11 out of 15 or 12 of 16 cases end in war. So the odds of somebody screwing it up are better than have people being far-sighted and imaginative in terms of their adjustments. So go ahead,
There's
please.
some dissent about how many of these power transitions have been and how many actually ended in war.
Right.
There's always theories of, power transition and Organsky, Kugler, and so on, and it's a little more complex than that. But I think it's an excessive concentration on this sort of systemic kind of pressures, presumably leading to war, is a problem, because we fail to see, for instance, going back to your assessment that China is a monolithic entity. Well, Mao's China may have been one, but Mao's China was different than China today, which gives you a sense that entities out there are not just perennial fixtures of the international landscape. They change according to internal developments, democracy, not democracy, accession to the global economy, or extrication from the global economy. And so those things matter. It's not just some inexorable balance of power situation that leads to war or the absence of war.
I think that's a very good reminder. There's no determinism in this situation, but recognizing structural stresses or the magnitude of a challenge, if you go back to Steve Bosworth's good line, reminds you that you got to do something extra and special to avoid results that you don't want to.
I'm particularly concerned because many of us explain World War I exactly in those terms of balance of power, the inexorability, the bound to happen kind of situation. Not so, not so. There were definite drivers that were internal to some of the countries, particularly Germany, but not only Germany, that were actually the driving forces that resulted in World War I. Not some sort of mysterious, hidden hand of, balance of power. You've written a lot against balance of power as sort of a defining, driver of war and peace, and I agree with that.
So I think we're going to go to the audience for questions. Let me tell you how the game works. There are 2 microphones on the ground floor and 2 microphones in the loge. All questions are welcome, as long as they're brief, and they end with a question mark, and 1 per customer. We'll start. Please identify yourself first. Thank you.
Well, my name is Fred Hapgood. Will that do?
Say.
Well, my name is Fred Hapgood.
Thank you.
That's okay?
Thank you.
Okay. You know, if I was like trying to seriously think about what a war might look like, the big difference in 1914 is the role of air power. It's very hard to imagine China deciding to do something serious in the United States without having a serious idea about how to affect air power. And that seems like an awful long way off.
Good question.
Not next year, yeah.
I guess I'd take away from that is that, and I very much agree with your last point, wars are avoidable if we have far-sighted leaders to be very trite about it. But the leader has to say on the eve of the conflict, before it starts, how could this end? And I think in 1914 in August, it was a failure of imagination to think that 15 to 16 million people could be dead in 4 years. Or in 1937, 60 million people could be dead by 1945. And I think in the nuclear age, given the power of China, Russia, the United States, Britain and France, that's the first question the president has to ask, or the prime minister. And I think, Graham, if I'm not mistaken, in Essence of Decision, Kennedy at some point asked in October 1962, how many people could die between the Urals and the Rockies?
Oh, absolutely.
You have to start there.
So, this gentleman, please introduce yourself.
Good evening. I'm Nicholas. I'm French. My 2 great-grandfathers fought the First World War.
Oh,
My
good.
2 grandfathers fought the Second World War, and that's for the legacy. My question is, we've seen a lot of focus today around the US-Chinese risk, and I commend Professor Burns' words of cautions, because if we want to prevent peace, we need to prepare for war and see it coming. And the points that some have made around nuclear weapons as the key game changer between 1914 and today, for me, is very important. But I happen to have spent almost 10 years in India, and the Indo-Pakistani relationship, and the way we have seen this relationship potentially escalating in a nuclear conflict, for me, is a source of interest and worries. And I'd like Professor Burns and the panel to address this risk as well, and how the nuclear relationship is an enabler of peace as well as of risk at a level which is really high loss.
Very good question. Nick.
You're right to ask the question, and thank you for asking it. I think if you had asked President Clinton or even President George W. Bush and maybe President Obama in the first couple of years of administration, where's the most likely scenario, they might have answered India and Pakistan. After that horrific attack on Mumbai in November 2008, I think the world was fortunate that Manmohan Singh was the Indian Prime Minister, because he literally pulled back. And he pulled back his population and a lot of his political colleagues from war with Pakistan. And Condoleezza Rice went out at the very end of her tenure as Secretary of State, essentially to stand between India and Pakistan and say, this can't happen. You have to figure out a way to argue over the issue of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Pakistani-based terrorist group, probably with the knowledge of the Pakistani government attacking Indian civilians. You needed a humane, far-sighted leader in Delhi to be restrained, but you can't always count on that. And Mr. Modi, I mean, he doesn't have a lot of experience in international politics. He's been a regional state leader. He's not had to confront this. I mean, God forbid there's another such attack. It's hard to anticipate how a different leader would react to it. So I think you're right. There's a stability among Moscow, Beijing, Washington, Paris, London, the nuclear weapons powers. That stability does not exist between Islamabad and Delhi.
Thank you. This gentleman, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Paul, a student here, also a student in Professor Burns' class. My question is, if in the event that China's eternal political structure were to evolve in a way that becomes more representative and transparent, and given that in the West we have a common notion that democracies don't fight against each other, how does that affect the United States' strategic interests with respect to China? Thank you.
Yeah, I told you we're talking about domestic politics, so
Yeah,
maybe
Okay.
why don't you
you want
start?
to talk? Yeah.
I'm happy to address that point to some extent. So I see two drivers shifting China away from a more sort of combative posture. And the two are the likelihood that it remains interested in internationalization as the primary mode of political survival at home. That has nothing to do yet with democracy. So the internationalizing drive, number one. And number two, yes, there is this near law of international relations that democracies don't wage war against each other. Democracy would be superimposed on this internationalizing drive away from war. However, there is also a theory advanced by scholars who study the democratic peace that says that the transition towards democracy unleashes a period of high nationalism that actually doesn't work very well in terms of ensuring a democratic peace. Stable democracies, yes, you have some sort of regularity that they don't wage war against each other. But democratizing states undergo that period of tension, internal tension that may not, particularly hyper-nationalism, that may not work very well over that period. Now, if democratization happens in tandem with a sustained drive towards internationalization, maybe those dangers are lesser. But if democratization happens in a context where engagement with the global economy is less robust, then you have a much more tricky situation.
Well, I would simply say, in regard to Nick's point, yes, you're right, and the American Secretary of State was there on the frontier, et cetera, but deterrence worked. Pakistan did not attack India, India did not attack Pakistan. In some of these key cases, they certainly bluster, and they send all sorts of terrorists into each other's country, but they still don't fight it out in nuclear terms. And I think that's what we have to accept vis-a-vis China. Obviously, we're not going to keep China from rising. It's going to rise. Will that be peaceful? Mearsheimer thinks not. I think it depends on what you mean by peaceful. If you mean by peaceful, will it be love and hugging everybody? It obviously isn't going to be that kind of peace. But if you mean that you can control the kinds of expressions of conflict that might otherwise take place, I think the answer is yes, you can control those. And we would be aided by the Japanese, the Europeans, and a whole series of East Asian states in dealing with China that would basically go to Beijing and say, cool it. You know, if you're trying to kick the U.S. out of its naval engagements in this area of the world, you're never going to succeed. So stop doing it. Just last year, as you remember, we went to Beijing, and Joan and I said, you guys are your own worst enemies. It's your expression of ownership of all these island chains, et cetera, that is causing the problems that you yourself face. So just cool it, move back, and you'll find things will be much better for you. And the Xi Jinping leadership listened. So this past year when we went, they were much more sotto voce on these topics. They didn't withdraw from any of their claims, but they're not pressing the claims, and they know that time is not necessarily on their side.
And to reinforce your point, there are many more meetings between Japanese and Chinese military officials, non-military officials, academics. There are many things going on in the last 3 months that seems to suggest exactly that, an effort to really move away from that brink.
Do you want to make
And
a
let's
comment?
just look for a handshake between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Abe at the G20 meeting. We hope that they're going to actually meet.
There won't be a photograph, though.
It's okay. It goes back to leadership. These two have to have to develop a way of working with each other directly, and let's hope that starts in about 2 weeks' time.
And leadership would also be not visiting Yasukuni Shrine,
Yeah,
by the way.
Agreed.
By the way.
Yeah.
And leadership is also not offering blank checks.
yes, absolutely.
Please.
Good evening. I'm Alexander Rasulimo, president of the Center for Security and Social Progress, a think tank. If there is a conflict akin to World War I, what role, what could be the impact of the social media, for instance, in mitigating or abetting the conflict?
Actually, it's a very interesting question because even though I'm among those that argue that 2014 is so different from 1914, there are actually many things that do remind 1914. This is one of them. There was an explosion of media, not as we know it today, in different form, newspapers and so on, at the very beginning of the 20th century. And media was a carrier of hyper-nationalism everywhere, in Germany certainly, but also elsewhere. And some people say, maybe without that means of enhancing nationalism and hyper-nationalism, we might have been better off. We now have a different kind of media that is also enabling or carrying hyper-nationalist voices in China in particular, but also elsewhere. So that's one thing. That's one thing to watch. At the same time, again, among the sort of positive developments recently, apparently the Chinese leadership is clamping down on certain terms. For instance, boycott Japan has been apparently excised from some of this social media. Many of the terms that were really carriers of anti-Japanese sentiments apparently are no longer enabled over that kind of media. So media is something that the Chinese leadership, and unfortunately most of the time, controls. Right? It can unleash more nationalism or less nationalism, sometimes at will. Not completely, it doesn't control it completely. But it is an important carrier of
But of
mobilization.
course, it can go the other way, too. That is, the Hong Kong media has been able to get out their position, and it's influenced a huge number of people, particularly in Taiwan. And now it's going to be much, much harder to convince the Taiwanese, yeah, let's just join you, and become part of the mainland of China, because they see the way Hong Kong is being treated. They don't want to be treated that way. And so I think what the Chinese have done by virtue of what's happened in Hong Kong is to put off the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland for at least a decade and maybe longer, because they have a huge bad press now in a whole series of countries owing to Twitter, owing to a whole series of things.
I think if we're looking again, you can make two columns, but if you're looking for columns for things to worry about, to the extent that Hong Kong and the social media have infected Taiwanese politics
Yes.
in ways that make more likely Taiwan's interest in being more independent of China, if you believe that there's no way China will not fight for Taiwan, we have another scenario if we're trying to say, what could you conceive? Let's go to this gentleman, please.
Thank you. My name is Will Eberly. I'm a first-year MPP here at the Kennedy School. And one thing I've heard a lot of conversation about the structural causes of war, the lead up to the war, et cetera. But one thing that made, in my opinion, World War I so awful and so unique and revolutionary was the absolute destructive force of the technology unleashed during the war. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the potential impacts of emerging technology, defense technology such as drones or cyber technology, and our reliance on the internet in any type of potential 21st century conflict like this.
Great question and a big topic. Who wants to take a short answer?
You want to go?
No, you go.
Well,
I have
I think I particularly would talk about economic technology, because it does seem to me that's where technology makes a difference. It makes it possible for you to grow faster. It makes it possible for you to feed your people better than you would otherwise do. And there, I think, The Chinese are trying very, very hard to catch up, but they have not yet caught up. I mean, they've done a tremendous number of things from that wonderful place in Shanghai. I've forgotten now the number of that's attached to 60384 or something of that kind, that building that sort of penetrates American companies trying to find out what their technologies actually are.
Yeah.
But actually, the success of that is enormously questionable. So look at the major Chinese auto company now, which is Volvo. Can the Chinese provide the technology for Volvo? No. They're buying it from Bosch. So they have the real problem still of getting in the highest end of technology, at least in the civilian sector.
If you want to share.
I just suggest that I think we've had 60 years since the dawn of the hydrogen age to build into the systems and mentality of the Russian and American and Chinese leaderships, the European leaderships, how to contain a crisis from growing into a nuclear weapons crisis. We don't have much experience with the cyber dimension. It's very new. The U.S. has established Cyber Command. We ran an Aspen Strategy Group conference 2 years ago. Professor Nye and Brent Scowcroft and myself, Professor Allison was there, trying to think about the cyber realm. And when you get to cyber warfare, does that make war more likely or less likely, especially on the cusp of war? If you have to worry about your satellites being taken out, GPS being obliterated, does it make you act more quickly and therefore in a more destabilizing way potentially? So you need to talk to the Chinese about this and the Russians about it to make sure that we all understand how that could be a destabilizing factor and thus make war more likely.
Quick point.
Actually, this gives me an opportunity to agree with on a previous point that this is one area, for instance, where accidents
Could happen.
Yeah. On the whole, though, I always think of technology, of technologically deterministic theories of war or anything else as wrong-headed. Because technology is, after all, in the hands of humans that operate it. Sometimes, for instance, the technologies of the offensive that favor the offense used to be sort of blamed for, the theories of, but in reality, there isn't such a thing. Technologies can serve both the case of peace and the case of war, right? It depends on, again, who uses why, when, and how. And this is an area that really, really is worrisome. So some sort of commitment to work on a common set of rules is really imperative in this area.
This gentleman in the lodge, please.
Thank you. I'm a Korean journalist, so me and 15 company fly 12 hours to attend this event. So in Chinese history, they always want to be the number one in the world. So if you were Chinese, what is the way how to be the number one in the world for Chinese view? So I want to know about it. And if there is some way to relate it with North Korea.
Okay. I think it's a very authentic expression of a very understandable instinct and helps us see this dynamic. So what do you guys want to say about it?
I think the Chinese leadership is very sophisticated about the world. And there's no inevitability that every Chinese leader would seek global domination. I think they understand that Japan's powerful, that India is powerful, that the United States is powerful, and they need to share the space with us. The questions always are, which part of the space? Where do we work out the rules of the road? But I don't see, if you read Kissinger's brilliant 2000 book on China, I think he's pretty convincing. You cannot make a case that China is trying to dominate the world. They want to be the strongest power in Asia. And there's where the coming tension is with the U.S. alliance system and China. But I believe with good leadership and a lot of work between Beijing and Washington, we can keep the region peaceful and compete peacefully.
So if I could take one bite at this apple, the world's premier China watcher for me is Lee Kuan Yew, who's the founder of Singapore. And in this little book on Lee Kuan Yew that I published last year with a colleague, we ask him questions, and then the book consists of his concise answers. So one of the questions is, are China's current leaders serious about displacing the U.S. as the number one power in Asia in the foreseeable future. Now, I like Henry Kissinger's book too, but in 1,000 pages it says on the one hand, on the other, goes this way or that way. Lee Kuan Yew's answer, of course, why not? Who could imagine otherwise? Next question.
But
Okay.
I want to address something. I didn't, are you from China?
Korea.
No, I'm Korean.
Korea.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood because there was a very interesting series broadcasted in Chinese TV on the rise and fall of empires, and I thought you might have seen that. It was a very thoughtful way of, I only saw one episode, the one on actually German, the 20th century, Germany, World War I, World War II. It was very skillfully made to basically warn China, even the Chinese leadership, one might say, to avoid the kind of destruction brought on Europe through World War I and World War II. So I thought it was a good sign of, even if you can call it indoctrination, or war.
And a recognition of the structural tension that comes from rise.
Right.
So this gentleman.
Hi, my name is Sid, and my question is, I want the panel's opinion on a particular scenario. Given like the slowing growth in China, could that mean more Hong Kong-like demonstrations within China? In that scenario, would the Chinese be more entangled domestically, and would that reduce chances of an external conflict? Or would that give the Communist Party the idea that now the only way to get everybody united behind the flag is to open an external front, whether it's India, China, Taiwan, US, whatever? But
Great question. Let me say, because we have a number of questions and a short amount of time, not everybody needs to answer every question, and please answer it briefly. This would be a topic for a whole nother session, but if anybody wants to make a short answer.
I would simply say that there are all sorts of ways of bringing the Chinese in, even if they're conceiving their position as being number one. You can be number one in a whole lot of different things and not necessarily be number one in all. I mean, look at all those years in which China was number one, thinking it was ruling the world, and it was the great Middle Kingdom. But in fact, it wasn't ruling the world. It thought it was, but it was not, in fact. And I think that's the kind of thing that you want to do for the Chinese now, is to give them some sort of latitude in which they can express their feeling about being number one without turning the world over to them. And nor do I think they expect that, in fact, to take place.
Does anybody else want to take a short bite at that? Please.
My name is John Milligan White. I'm from the Center for America-China Partnership in Beijing. One of the things I'm most worried about is that the United States has set itself up for a catastrophe. Basically, the population of China is 10 or 15 times that of Japan. We have a treaty to protect Japan.
Right.
So if Japan were to test that, we would either be at war with China or in conflict, or we would step back. If we step back, we're humiliated. If we don't step back, it's catastrophic. Either way, Japan would have a justification, if we step back, to have a nuclear bomb. So I see us basically as being out of control of our own destiny. They are going to test us. And we aren't going to go to war with China, even though we have an air-sea battle concept. So we're going to be humiliated. So we really have to think hard about what we're doing.
Well,
So his question, if we translated, a great question into 1914, is have we given a blank check
Yes.
to
right.
Japan? And since at least two members of our panel said that was the worst mistake
It was.
that the Germans made, you presumably disagree with Nick, but we'll let you go first.
well, I just disagree with the premise of the question, and I don't believe we've given Japan a blank check.
Right.
Stability in Asia and in Europe after the Second World War has been built on our alliances. We lead those alliances. We provide the nuclear umbrella for Western Europe. We certainly provide the nuclear umbrella for the Japanese people. And George Shultz, whom we interviewed last March for a project we're working on, interviewing all the living secretaries of state, he pointed again to Japan, our most important ally. And as long as we keep close to the Japanese, and they have the certainty that the United States will protect them. It's that kind of strength that makes conflict with China less imminent and less likely. If we begin to disavow our friends because we feel that these alliances somehow are destabilizing, I think that we risk emboldening the Chinese in a way that we'll live to regret. So I think what the United States has to do, and President Obama is doing it with his rebalancing to Asia, is rebuild those alliances with our democratic allies. China will understand it and respect it if we're strong, and they'll push against us if we're weak. So it's going to take a very tough-minded American approach to convince the Chinese not to be as assertive as they've been in the South and East China Seas in the last few years.
But that is a
Can I
blank
just-
check. Well, you
I'd
guys
just like
say.
to add to that one point. I think the Japanese have gone through a major change over the past 5 years. They're now much closer to NATO. They're going to provide military equipment for the Europeans. And I think as a result of that, they are not going to try to determine what we do. They're much more likely to have an alliance-oriented strategy rather than one that is just bilateral with the United States. And if that's true, we don't have to choose between either backing Japan or backing China. We can get the Japanese to hold back a little bit where it is necessary to do. And up to now, we've been completely successful at that.
Up to now. Jeff,
Up to now.
On your
please.
point on Japan's nuclearization,
Please.
I think, yeah.
It's okay, he can hear. No, we're good, we're good. She's just making her short answer.
Now, you mentioned the fear of Japan nuclearization. The nuclearization of Japan has been over-predicted so many times by some of our colleagues as well, 1981 and so on. It hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened even though in recent years, the Japanese leadership has been arguably the most nationalistic in recent decades. It hasn't happened. I think the Chinese know very well that in instances where they push too far, that is a possibility. And that's also a source of restraint.
Okay, thank you. But I think to the question with respect to the blank check, either it was a good idea for Germany to give to Austria-Hungary a blank check
Yes.
to say, we have your back, we have a security guarantee to you, or it was a bad idea, and two people here think it was a bad idea.
Very
Right.
bad.
Okay, and second, a treaty commitment to Japan that says if you find yourself in a war with China, we will be fighting with you, is what you would call a blank check.
No, it's
Now-
not.
No, it's
sorry,
not.
it's not a blank
No,
check.
no.
What is that?
I think there are huge historical differences between Germany
No,
and
no, I'm not saying
Austria-Hungary.
there's not differences, but
In
a blank check says, this check you have, I'm fighting if you're in a war with China. Or it says, not that. If you get in a war that I don't really like, I'm not fighting with you?
No, I think it's completely different in modern times, how diplomacy works. The fact is we talk to the Japanese every single day. And they're
It's a different question
Let me
why
just
they
finish.
may do it.
Let me just
Okay,
finish.
Okay.
We talk to them every day,
Right.
Graham.
Right.
And
A lot.
they know what we want and don't want. The Japanese leadership in Tokyo knows the last thing that Barack Obama wants is a conflict in the Senkakus. Will we defend him hypothetically if it happens? Of course we will. And the Chinese have to be convinced of that, and I think they are. But Barack Obama is playing peacemaker because he hasn't given Japan a blank check to start a conflict in the Senkaku Islands. So I would reject this symmetry between 1914 and 2014.
Yeah, let me just add one point on that. I mean, there was, after all, a dual alliance between Austro-Hungary and Germany. But that wasn't a blank check until the Kaiser said on July 5th,
Yes.
1914, it's a blank check. Just having a treaty doesn't mean you were given somebody else a blank check. And we will never, I believe, give Japan a blank check for all the reasons you've just mentioned.
Okay. This gentleman, are you up or no? Here we are, then the last question.
Good evening. My name is Matt Kennedy, and I'm one of the National Security Fellows here at the Harvard Kennedy School. 100 years ago, there was a chain of events that put forces in Europe on a collision course that ended up in war. And as we learned tonight, had one of those links of that chain or several of those links of the chain been broken, history could have been very different.
Right.
If we were to come to the present day, where would you put your mind and your assets and your actions to find the most critical actions to break links so that we reduce the possibility of another great war?
Let me just respond to that in a very quick way. I think what you want to do is to form a coalition that is so strong that China will want to join. And maybe it's not ready to join now, but as this coalition gets stronger and stronger, both economically and militarily, at a certain point, you tell the Chinese, you can join in with us in this overarching coalition, which Bismarck did, during the 1870s, and actually which took place under the Concert of Europe for the whole period of 1815 to 1848. So you get that sort of thing going and say, you can be a charter member of this, and when that happens, we'll work out the details and our own agreements.
So we haven't spoken a lot here about the global economy and the current state of interdependence, which I see as crucially important in separating 2014 from 1914. So one of the things we need to do is to ensure that we no longer have the kind of debacles we've seen in the last 5 years, because the consequences of a decline in the global economy are extremely high for China, for the future of China and all of us, and for the possibility that a different kind of coalitions, much more oriented towards war scenarios, could indeed take over under those conditions, when you don't have the ability to do business the way we do today. And the other reinforcing part of this argument is to build robust institutions at every level. There is a trilateral conversation going on between China, Japan, and South Korea on a free trade area. There are all sorts of free trade, in addition to TTP and TTIP and so on. All of these institutions, economic, security, and so on, have to be made so much more robust. They're already there. They weren't there in 1914. If they're more robust, the more we can guarantee that none of these accidents happen without anybody having a hand on stopping them from happening.
Nick, we give you the last word.
All right, so I think it's intriguing that the most disruptive great power actor of 2014, Vladimir Putin, has barely made an impression on all of us tonight. None of us have raised him. That's another form. I think there's two things with the Chinese that I would venture Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, John McCain, Mitt Romney, Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush would agree on. I mean, I think just looking at the mainstream center of our politics, that we've got to maintain American military power in Asia, particularly our naval and air power. And that I fear an isolationist Republican right and Democratic left will not allow President Obama to do what the most important thing I think he said in foreign policy: we need to shift east. We can't be caught in Middle East wars for the next decade. We need to maintain our position strategically. That's the most important thing. The Chinese will respect that. They won't like it. Secondly, we need to think of China differently than we thought of Mao's China or Stalin's Soviet Union. They are our natural partner on climate, on trafficking, on crime, on drugs, on terrorism. So while we've got to be strong, we've also got to find a way to build confidence, trust, and a working relationship with them. Early test, since 195 countries are not going to get to a climate change agreement in 2015, I think President Obama and President Xi want to form a Chinese-American agreement and then ask the next 20 biggest economies to sign on. If they can do that together, it'll be an early indication that we have arrived at a place where we respect China's power. We respect the fact that they've already risen. They're not just rising, and that we need to work as partners. But the first one's important too. Without that strength, I don't think the second one can happen.
Good point.
So unfortunately, we've come to the witching hour. The topic, could World War I happen again? Let me see the last slide here, if we can. John F. Kennedy thought about this question a good bit, And this quote's worth reading the whole thing, but basically looking back, particularly at Barbara Tuchman's wonderful volume, The Guns of August, he had been reading it and thinking about it actually during the missile crisis. And he loved the quote that said, "How did this all happen?" And the German chancellor said, if we only knew. So I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep over the likelihood that we have another great war in the year ahead, but I'm certainly not going to dismiss the possibility. And for illuminating it for us, let's say thanks for a great panel. Well done. Good.